I'm not one to say that, like, I'll never tell my students bring in music because it's poetry, because I think that there's such high-level poets out there that some musicians don't get anywhere close to it.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Westerbrook's a great musician. He's somewhat of a poet, you know what I mean? He was born on the same day as me, December 31st, not the same year. He's about 15 years older than me. And there was a line in one of his songs called Income Tax Deduction, One Hell of a Function. And I realized why, because December 31st babies, our parents get the whole
That's right.
year
You get the
deducted.
whole year.
And so now that line makes a lot of sense to me, and it's about me, which is really cool. So now I think me and Paul are kismet, which he doesn't know anything about me, but maybe someday.
Yeah.
Paul Westbrook. Replacements.
Yeah.
So super, super cool.
Confronting authors with real questions about the writing process, the difficult and disheartening publishing industry, and why anyone would choose to torture themselves in the world of writing, this is the Literally Podcast with your host, writer, runner, and the literary voice of Ogden, Utah, Case Johnston. Exposing literature, the authors, the business, the process. The Literally Podcast.
We're here on Booked on 25th Street. This is the Literally Podcast with Case Johnston. Today our host is the Poet Laureate of Logan, Star Coulbrooke. That's right. Our guest today is Star Coulbrooke. She's going to read us some poems.
I'm going to start with the poem that I composed for the Logan City Council. When I became Poet Laureate, one of the things they required was for the Poet Laureate to compose a poem. So I composed my inaugural poem, and this was the first City Council meeting I went to as Poet Laureate. It was May 19th, 2015. City of Poetry. In downtown Logan, where artists inhabit bicycle shops and cafes, tattoo parlors and churches, where paintings and sculptures and photographs adorn the sporting goods stores and the old hotels, line the walls along stairways and narrow aisles among the coat hangers, above the tables, along the counters near the checkout stand, there's a bookstore mentality held over from the days when poetry was valued as artwork, as an escape from the mundane workaday life, when people would read it everywhere they went, memorize their favorite verses, recite them over dinner. Let's keep going there, keep going back to poetry, forward to more poetry. Let's plaster it on the walls of the city, compose our lines and stamp them in cement at every new roundabout, every sidewalk. Let's write poems to each other about our lives in the city of poetry, where everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what age or persuasion, what family, what job, what form of transportation, or what inclination, will have a say, will know they matter. Let's let poetry matter. Let metaphor replace all diatribes, all misunderstandings. Let's say it in poetry, straight from the soul, not from media feeds, not from Google or TV or mass email, but out of the heart, where our stories reside, where our memories and hopes don't fight with each other, where art, for art's sake, becomes our priority. Here in the city of poetry, let's look to the backyards where families come out on a Sunday evening to watch urban owls rise from blue spruce and juniper on silent wings to go beyond the town and return before Monday's first white dawning swept with canyon air from the forest's scent of summer to the paved wide streets where our cars and buses take us to work and to school, where we can think all day of the stories we'll tell when poetry rolls off our tongues like water over a spillway, fresh and clear and powerful. This is a poem I wrote for the Logan City Council and the mayor. June 3rd is when I first composed it, and September of 2015 is when I revised it. This is on the topic of neighborhood revitalization. When I do these poems for the City Council, I'm the first person who comes in, and they take the place of a prayer, and I think poems are wonderful prayers. Two sides of the road, a walking tour. On the hillside to our left, evening primrose blooms ghost white among short milkweed, spike-leaved, clustered with tight yellow buds. On our right, a golden deer. It claims the yard where this house once made up the neighborhood, no others but the deer, four more appearing among swing set, playhouse, dark green lawn, ears twitching, grazing as we walk on by. Look left again, above our newfound primrose, to houses hunkering like giants, plaster facades grinning down the gravel delta, wooden stakes and orange ribbons marking subdivisions yet to join them, families with children waiting. See the deer? They cross this road twice every day, new obstacles to jump with every phase of moon we'll soon see rising on the right like half a lemon in the sky, salted with profiles of backhoes, dump trucks, mortgage makers. Take heart for the swallows that dip and tumble through the bug-thick dusk, gorging on mosquitoes that whine past our ears as we swat at them, as the peach-pink sunset spans both sides of the sky and closes to steel-gray clouds, yellow half-moon haloing the grazing deer, burnishing the primrose, and you seeing both sides from the middle.
So I have two questions about Lee Starr. I just left a meeting, as you know, whose Starr has not volunteered, but she's kind of volunteered to help Ogden find our own poet laureate, because we need one. The city of Ogden needs one, and we're looking for one. I hope that we could get one as good as Starr someday. I have a question about place in poetry. So it sounds like I know that both of these poems were written for the city council, for Logan. Do you find that prompt difficult to write it specifically for Logan, or do you find that prompt easy? Or do your poems focus around a place and landscape naturally, or writing for the city council that way, where you know that your audience are just city council members before a meeting, and it is taking the place of prayer, and in a state that prayer is pretty common? Do you find it difficult, or is this something that you embraced pretty easily?
Easy, amazingly. And yet not so amazingly, because I love Logan and I've lived there all my life, mostly. The city council doesn't know what they're going to get. They just say, compose a poem. And I look around and I write a few things in my journal as I'm looking. And things just happen. Those poems tend to come forth and almost be all of a piece. There's rarely any revision in the poems that I compose for the Logan City Council. For one thing, the Logan City Council is so eager to hear my work, and they're so welcoming, and they all seem so thrilled with my poems that the next one comes easily. About place. I've hiked, walked around all of Cache Valley, all the mountains around. It's how I it's how I lived. It's how I was able to live through a different life in that town and in that area. And my work is healing. And so every time I get a poem that feels right, I feel redemption. And you say, about prayer. Poetry is my religion. Poetry is my prayer. Poetry is my rebelliousness. When I was getting together poems for the Lighthouse Lounge reading, I was thinking of a lot of different kinds of poems, and finally I had to settle on some that I've written a while ago that I presented for a women's club that talk about my previous life. And so I think poetry, as I write it for the city council, it flows forth from a deep well of appreciation.
I love the idea that the council members are waiting for you to read. That's what we want here. You know, that's what we're aching for here in Ogden. And I hope maybe one day we can have you come read for our council members before we elect our poet laureate, because that makes me just really happy inside to expect to see you in front of council members and just to see them waiting for you to give a poem to them. And about Logan too. It's, to me, that's that merging of art and city and community is so important, and I'm so glad that Logan has that. And Star's gonna read some more poems.
I am, and first I want to tell you that I wasn't only reading it to the city council. The first night that I did that first meeting, the entire council chamber was packed. Logan really wanted a poet laureate, so that was really cool.
Do you think we can steal you, or are you stuck there? You know, I mean, we could give you a different name.
You're so cute.
Exactly right.
This one's called Trees. In dreams they fall without a sound. One leans, a graceful, slow uprooting, lies down full-leafed, takes the next, which takes the next, until the row of trees, maple, elm, or sumac, splash to earth, a wash of color over headstones, leaves of autumn mixed together, cover names of dead encased in granite, marble, names of children living, lists we make to say who we have fathered, take them to the grave with us. Or do our children choose the stones when we are gone, engrave their names behind our own, feel the pull of all that weight on soft earth, leaning, a descent to that dark place where tree roots make their way down. I want to say that poem was published in the City Art Journal. Ken Brewer, my mentor, who was the Utah Poet Laureate, the second one, used to bring me down to Salt Lake City to read in the open mic, and he even got me featured once, and City Art Journal published this poem and a few of my other poems. I have a special place in my heart for city art, even though they don't have their own poet laureate. 2-poem warning, 2 poems to go. Too thin to hold. Each late fall, the llama takes a fawn under her loafing shed wing, usually a sick one down from the hills, too weak to last the winter. She gives it a corner washed in morning sun, guards it from stray dogs, eagles, mountain lions. Her keeper leaves fresh hay bales round the barn for warmth, brings oats in a bowl. The llama, old, arthritic, gets up spryly with 6 aspirin, plier crushed, sprinkled on her food. Bozo the barn cat, paws of a bobcat, fur cream-colored and long as alpaca, looks out from his bed of cast-off coats in the loft, belly full of vole. He surveys the farm for a yellow stray to take in, snuggle partner till spring, who'll wear out its welcome by eating his songbirds and bunnies. Cats wild and feral retreat before Bozo, defender of barn squirrels, port in a storm. The llama watches their backs, these cats of all kinds, as they slink up the road to the gravel pit, disturbing wild turkeys who lift their unwieldy bodies like bombers who land in tree branches too thin to hold them. But they do. I'm from Riverdale, Idaho. I was brought up on the river, so the wildlife there gets written about a lot. Final poem, Yellow Yarrow. This poem is an acrostic, which the first letter of each line starts with the letters in the title. And as I was writing along, I realized that I had done yellow and then yellow again. So then I wrote yarrow, but I decided to leave it as yellow, Yellow Yarrow, but its title is still Yellow Yarrow. Yellow to gold from June through August, taupe in September, embers on umbels atop straw-like stalks gone spotted with mold, last of the summer's fickle weather. Long days give way to sun red with smoke, old rituals of burning fields at harvest end, the yarrow a border, wanton and stubborn among the wire fence line, hardy as cactus. Yards and yards of yellow hedge, wide, profuse, sturdy as the tech industrial building, glinting in slick siding, rising just across the highway to the west, reflecting morning sun, sheen of steel and glass, omen at the start and end of every season, woven in the landscape with this net of pungent weeds. Yes, don your gloves, take your side cuts, clip off the seed heads, each cluster a sachet of dry grains packed tight for the breaking, leaf-locked at the base, holding on. Let your pockets fill, a perennial itch only this non-spreading yarrow can satisfy. Not pink, not white, but yellow to gold to taupe, summer in the seeds and fall.
Thank you, Star. Thank you for sharing your poetry with us. It's really an honor that you came down to visit with us on the Literary Podcast. We're at Booked on 25th Street, on historic 25th Street in downtown Ogden, Utah. Our guest today is Star Coulbrooke. She's the Poet Laureate of Logan, and I've known Star for about 2 years. I think the first time I really met was Star. I got to read at Helicon West in Logan. And if you're not familiar with Helicon West, this is a reading series that is very, very serious and has had some very, very famous writers come through. So if you've never had a chance to get up there, you really should. You need to look at their schedule for over the next year. You guys are probably booked out for this year, aren't you? Oh.
Yes.
Yeah. Because they bring in some of the best writers. It's a great space. They have great open mic afterwards. It's a serious deal up there in Logan. And I got to read there with Utah Reflections for the first time. And then this summer, which was, it's always an honor. And I always appreciate getting to read up there. And I have to tell a story, and I'm going to tell this story. I told this story last week at Poet Flow at the Lighthouse Lounge every Tuesday night at 7. That when I read there this summer, and I'll tell the story again because we have a different audience and they don't know. And this isn't an old story. This is a new story. It's not one of my rusty, dusty ones that people get sick of, right? It's I read an essay. It was a short essay. It was probably 7 or 8 minutes long, and it's one of my favorite essays, and it's an award-winning essay, and I'm proud of that essay. And I was watching Star, because when you read, you see everybody. People don't think you see everybody, but you see everybody. And Star was taking notes, and I thought she was critiquing me. I thought that I was getting a B. So afterward, the other guest speaker read, and which was fabulous. And I'm always happy to read first to get it over with. So Star got up and she said, "Well, I wrote a poem while you were reading that was inspired by your reading." And I thought to myself, "Wow!" First off, and then I felt a lot better because I wasn't getting a B. And she got up and read a poem that she had written during my reading about my essay. And As a writer, when somebody else takes your words seriously like that, it's such a compliment, and it's a gift when somebody looks at something that you've written and bases a poem on that. So I want to say thank you. And I'm going to read that tonight at Poet Flow. When it comes to your craft, for new writers, for new poets, and I don't want to say young, because we have people who later in their life, they realize, I'm a writer. They could be 60 and they recognize, I've always been a writer. Now it's just time to write. I've always been a poet. Now it's just time to write poetry. What advice do you give them? We've really, for the most part, on this podcast, have had prose. I think you're our first poet, and we're really happy about that. What do you give young poets when they start to look at their work for the first time? Because that's a scary thing.
As Poet Laureate, I don't give advice. I have found that that's the best way to do what I do as Poet Laureate. My job is to take poetry around, share it, give people a lot of different kinds of poetry, but I want it all to be highly accessible. I want it to be something that people can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
So the poems I choose to take around and share will mostly be narrative and often lyrical, because music touches the soul. And then I do poetry walkabouts. So every third Thursday of the month, I announce that we're going to a particular part of town, a park or a street or a store area, and people come along. We read poems and we appreciate them. We don't say a lot about them. And then I give them a prompt when we get to our destination, and everyone sits around and writes, and then people read their poems to us if they want to. And they are always amazing poems because they've come on the spot. They have no worry behind them. They know that they're not going to be critiqued. They're not even going to get any kind of advice. They're only going to get sheer appreciation. Then I ask the people to send those poems to me, and sometimes they just hand them to me on the spot and with their email address, and I type them up and send them back to the people. And then I include them in the community collaborative commemorative poem. And I'm going to do one at the end of every year of my term, and I present those to the city council. People put their heart, their humor, their sorrow, their contemplation, their laughter, their silliness into those poems, their seriousness into those poems. And people come up to me after the walkabouts and after different workshops, and they say, I didn't know I could write poems, or I haven't written a poem for 20 years. Or we get some people like Isaac Tim, who's a regular at the walkabouts and at Helicon West, who will write 2 or 3 poems every time we go. And he insists that that's the way he writes. He wouldn't write if it were not for the walkabouts. So young poets, new poets, poets who haven't written for a long time, that's the most important thing. Write it. And then we can talk about it later, and we can discuss things if they want to. But getting it on the page as a heartfelt, true piece of themselves is what I aim to do first.
And you said you don't give advice, but you gave the universal advice. Right. And I can attest to this. I was at the last reading. A young woman wrote or read a poem about how people were watching her on her phone writing a poem.
Yes.
And it was a hell of a poem.
Yeah.
And I wish that I could go every Thursday. Those are on Tuesdays or Thursdays?
Thursdays, every second and fourth Thursday.
Yeah. And you say you don't give advice, but that was some of the best advice I'd ever heard for poets, or for writers. probably in my life. So that's very, I can see, I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Case. It's sincere, it's uninhibited. And then you go from there.
Yeah. I think people get scared.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, we talk a lot about this on this podcast, and we've talked about it before, of this kind of the fraud complex, as the writers have. And I haven't beaten it yet. You know, I don't know if we ever do, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to be a writer, you just have to write, and you have to go and explore. And I was listening the other night to C-SPAN, which of course has book TV, and I'm a real geek that way. Like, if my family's gone, my 5-year-old doesn't love C-SPAN and book TV. He does not find it that entertaining. But if my family's gone, I'm watching book TV, you know, and I like it because it talks a lot about craft, you know, how a book was written, who the audience was, all the research that went into it. That's people. I don't think a lot of people understand what it takes to write a novel, a full creative nonfiction book, and all the time and the research and so on and so forth. So I love C-SPAN that way because it kind of confirms that I didn't waste my time. But the best part about it, and I think it goes back to what you were saying about your walks, explore. You know, the more you explore this world, the more you'll have to write about, because you're not only going there physically, but you're going there spiritually, and the more you get out there, the more probably I think the more the world's going to speak to you, and you'll have more conversation with what's happening around you, and that personally lends me to prose. I'm not much of a poet. I've tried a few times, and I think only smart people are poets. But I think that exploratory view of it is beautiful.
And the research. Poets do research as well. So I wrote a sesquicentennial poem for the city council that took a lot of research, and it was fun. And I got to look at a lot of old pictures. Oh, poems come from pictures so much. Mm-hmm. There's a lot in a picture that no one ever sees until a poet discovers it, writes about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think people understand how much research goes into, and I tell my students this, and even though they're writing prose, I tell them we need to learn from poets, because every word counts. I think sometimes with students who write prose, they feel like they can get away with a bad sentence between two good sentences, that nobody's going to see it, right? But with poets, there's no leeway. Every word counts. That's why I make them read poetry.
Everyone should read poetry.
I agree. It's mind expanding. It is. So I have one last question. When you see a new poet, somebody who's really just starting to explore, and I know that you teach a lot of new poets. When you see a new poet, once they start to write poetry and then continue writing poetry, and I was going to ask this along with the advice question, but I'm not going to anymore. Do you see any shift in them personally as people once they start to explore writing poetry? Or have you seen, or do you have an anecdote for that?
I'm fortunate in that I do teach poetry writing. Not so much anymore because my writing center job is taking up a lot more of my time. But I've had students who've taken the introduction to poetry writing course and then the advanced poetry writing course. Some of them you don't see a lot of difference in their work, in their voice, in the way they put words down on the page. Some of them you see a miraculous difference between 1 year or one semester and then the next time they take the writing course. But the coolest thing is those people, those students who really catch it, and they go on to become organizers of poetry events, editors of, for instance, Sugar House Review. Sugar House Review editors were my best poetry writing class ever. Every student in that class has gone on to do something amazing with poetry, and that's been that's been a long time ago.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite 20 years, 15. 16 years, since 2000. So they progress in miraculous ways. They become strong in their voice and style. They become something I wouldn't have imagined some of them to become as far as writers. Some of them go on and just strengthen, and grow as writers, but still keep that same voice and sensibility they had when they were in my first class. They just build on it. So writing, I think, and exploring the way they do, from the basics of poetry through the critiques of poetry and through their life work in poetry, that gives me validation as a teacher. I know that I gave them a little bit, and then they took it and ran with it, and it became entirely their own.
Absolutely. Thank you, Star. We're at Booked on 25th on historic 25th Street, and we've been fortunate enough to have Star Coulbrooke as our guest today on the Literally podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Case.
Yeah.